Zephyra's massive form curled around the crystal spire that jutted from her homeworld surface. Her scales dulled to an ashen gray that reflected her inner emptiness. The other Draconians had long since given up trying to understand her condition. For 3,000 years she had been trapped in this state of perpetual melancholy, immune to every joy the galaxy had to offer. The Council of Elders had tried everything. They brought her the most beautiful star songs from the Melodian nebulae, their harmonies capable of moving entire civilizations to tears of happiness. Zephyra listened with polite attention, but her expression remained vacant. The empathic healers from Valdris Prime spent months projecting waves of pure bliss directly into her consciousness. Yet she felt nothing but the familiar hollow ache that had become her constant companion. Master artisans from a dozen worlds crafted sculptures that could make hardened warriors weep with wonder. The quantum poets composed verses that existed in 17 dimensions simultaneously, their words capable of rewriting the very fabric of emotion. The chromatic dancers performed rituals of joy that had once lifted an entire species from the brink of extinction through despair. Nothing worked. Zephyra remained trapped behind walls of sadness that seemed impossible to breach. Her condition had become legendary across the galaxy. The greatest philosophers debated her existence in universities spanning hundreds of light years. Some claimed she represented the ultimate proof that true happiness was merely an illusion. Others insisted she was cursed by ancient forces beyond comprehension. Religious leaders proclaimed her a living testament to the suffering inherent in all existence, while scientists studied her neural patterns in hopes of understanding the deepest mysteries of consciousness itself. The irony wasn't lost on anyone, that Zephyra belonged to a species renowned for their capacity for joy. Draconians were natural empaths, able to share emotions across vast distances and amplify positive feelings throughout entire star systems. Their homeworld was a pilgrimage destination for beings seeking happiness and emotional healing. Yet here was their most ancient and revered member, completely cut off from the very gift that defined her people. Zephyra's sadness had practical consequences beyond her personal suffering. Her emotional state created a dampening field that stretched for miles around her dwelling, making it difficult for other Draconians to maintain their natural exuberance. Crops grew more slowly in her presence, and the planet's famous healing springs lost much of their potency. The Draconian leadership had gently suggested she might be more comfortable on an uninhabited world, but she refused to leave, clinging to the faint hope that someday, somehow, something might reach her. She had tried ending her existence several times over the centuries, but Draconians were notoriously difficult to kill, and her people always intervened before she could succeed. Eventually, she accepted her fate with the same numb resignation that colored everything else in her life. She would continue existing, serving as a living monument to inexplicable suffering, until the universe itself grew cold and dark. The galactic community's attempts to help had evolved into something resembling a competition. Wealthy individuals and entire governments offered enormous rewards to anyone who could make Zephyra smile, even briefly. The most exotic pleasures and experiences in known space were paraded before her. She was taken on journeys to witness the birth of new stars, shown the hidden wonders of pocket dimensions, and introduced to forms of art and entertainment that existed nowhere else in the galaxy. Nothing worked. If anything, the constant parade of failed attempts only deepened her despair. She began to see herself as fundamentally broken, a creature so damaged that even the combined wisdom and resources of galactic civilization couldn't repair her. The weight of everyone's disappointment added another layer to her suffering, creating a feedback loop that made her condition progressively worse. Her fellow Draconians eventually learned to work around her presence rather than trying to change it. They developed new meditation techniques to shield themselves from her emotional field and created elaborate celebration areas far from her dwelling. Life on their homeworld continued, but with a permanent shadow cast by their most famous resident's unending sorrow. Scientists from the Analytical Consortium had spent decades studying her case, producing thousands of papers and theories but no solutions. They mapped every neural pathway in her massive brain, analyzed her genetic code down to the quantum level, and even attempted to recreate her exact biochemistry in laboratory settings. Their conclusion was always the same. There was nothing physically wrong with her. Her capacity for happiness existed intact. It simply refused to activate. The most disturbing aspect of Zephyra's condition was how it seemed to mock the very foundations of galactic civilization. Advanced societies prided themselves on their ability to solve any problem through technology, wisdom, or collaborative effort. Her continued suffering represented a fundamental failure of everything they believed about progress and the power of unity. Some younger Draconians had never known their world without her influence, and couldn't imagine what true collective joy might feel like. They grew up accepting diminished happiness as normal, which worried the elders greatly. Zephyra's sadness was becoming contagious across generations, potentially threatening the very nature of their species. Despite everything, a few optimists continued to believe that somewhere in the vast galaxy, a solution existed. They maintained that if beings could build ships that traveled faster than light and create artificial intelligence indistinguishable from consciousness itself, surely someone could find a way to bring joy to one lonely dragon. But as the centuries passed and failure followed failure, even the most hopeful began to doubt whether Zephyra would ever know happiness again. The cargo hauler Lucky Strike dropped out of hyperspace with all the grace of a falling asteroid, its aged engines coughing and sputtering as they struggled to maintain stable output. Jake Morrison wiped grease from his hands with a rag that had seen better decades and frowned at the diagnostic readout. The navigation computer was throwing error codes again, and the artificial gravity generator was making that concerning whining noise that usually preceded expensive repairs. "Just our luck," he muttered, plotting a course toward the nearest inhabited system. The ship's database identified it as Draconia Prime, homeworld of the Draconians and apparently some kind of spiritual healing center for the galaxy's wealthy and desperate. Jake snorted at the description. He'd been around long enough to know that most miraculous healing centers were just fancy tourist traps, designed to separate fools from their credits. The Lucky Strike had been his home for the past 15 years, ever since the Terran Colonial Authority had declared him surplus to requirements. After the mining accident on Kepler 442c, the compensation settlement had been just enough to buy a beaten-up cargo hauler and start over as an independent freight runner. It wasn't glamorous work, but it kept him fed and gave him the freedom to avoid the kind of corporate oversight that had nearly gotten him killed in the first place. His current cargo hold contained a mixture of industrial components bound for the Rigel sector, including some rare Earth elements that were apparently essential for maintaining certain types of alien technology. The manifest was routine enough, but the delays from his navigation problems meant he was already 3 days behind schedule. The shipping company would dock his pay for late delivery, assuming they didn't blacklist him entirely for unreliability. Jake had learned to expect the worst from alien civilizations during his years of independent hauling. Most species regarded humans as primitive curiosities at best, tolerated only because they were willing to take on the dangerous or unprofitable shipping routes that more advanced races avoided. The pay was terrible, the working conditions were hazardous, and respect was non-existent. But it beat working for human corporations that treated their employees like disposable equipment. As the Lucky Strike limped into Draconian space, Jake was surprised by the beauty of the system. The star was a warm golden yellow that reminded him of Earth's sun, and the planets orbited in perfect mathematical harmony. Draconia Prime itself was a jewel of blue and green, with massive crystal formations visible even from orbit. It looked nothing like the polluted industrial worlds where he usually made deliveries. The approach to the planet's main spaceport was equally impressive. Graceful towers spiraled into the sky like frozen music, their surfaces shifting between colors and patterns that seemed almost alive. Gardens and parks covered every available surface, creating a landscape that looked more like paradise than a functioning civilization. Jake had never seen anything quite so beautiful, though he tried not to let it show in his voice when he contacted the traffic controllers. The Draconian flight coordinator who guided him to a landing pad had a voice like wind chimes and seemed genuinely pleased to welcome him to their world. She explained that human visitors were somewhat rare but always appreciated, and she hoped his stay would be pleasant and restorative. Jake thanked her politely, while privately wondering what kind of restoration she thought a cargo hauler could afford on what was, obviously, a luxury destination. After securing his ship and completing the necessary customs paperwork, Jake discovered that his navigation repairs would take at least 3 days to complete. The local technicians were apologetic, but explained that human technology used different quantum resonance frequencies than most galactic standard equipment. They would need to fabricate custom interface components, which required time and careful calibration. The unexpected delay meant he was stuck on Draconia Prime with limited funds and no real plan for how to spend his time. The planet's tourism board had provided him with information about local attractions, but most seemed designed for wealthy spiritual seekers rather than working-class freight haulers. He wandered through the spaceport district, looking for somewhere affordable to eat and maybe find a quiet bar where he could wait out the repairs. What struck him most about the Draconians he encountered was their subdued demeanor. Despite living in what looked like paradise, they seemed oddly melancholy. Their famous empathic abilities meant that conversations often included emotional exchanges that Jake couldn't participate in, leaving him feeling isolated even in crowds. Still, they were unfailingly polite and helpful, going out of their way to ensure he felt welcome, despite the obvious cultural barriers. The local news broadcasts were dominated by discussions of someone called the Ancient Mourner, though Jake's translation software struggled with the religious and philosophical concepts involved. From what he could gather, this was some kind of spiritual figure whose suffering had become a central part of Draconian culture. The tone of the discussion suggested this was both deeply important and profoundly sad. Though Jake couldn't understand why an entire civilization would center their identity around someone else's pain, Jake's practical nature rebelled against the very concept. In his experience, dwelling on sadness was a luxury that working people couldn't afford. When life knocked you down, you got up, fixed whatever was broken, and kept moving forward. Sitting around feeling sorry for yourself was a good way to starve or get yourself killed. He wondered if the Draconians' advanced technology had made life so easy that they had forgotten this basic truth. Despite his cynicism, Jake found himself oddly affected by the planet's atmosphere. There was a weight in the air that seemed to press down on his spirits, making him think of all the losses and disappointments in his own life. His ex-wife Sarah, who had left him after the mining accident because she couldn't handle his mood swings and drinking. His brother Michael, killed in the corporate wars that had torn apart the outer colonies. The dreams of exploration and adventure that had died in the cramped confines of a cargo hauler's life. By his second day on Draconia Prime, Jake was actively looking forward to completing his repairs and leaving. The planet was beautiful and its people were kind, but there was something deeply unsettling about a civilization that seemed to worship sadness. He preferred the honest brutality of frontier worlds to this strange mixture of luxury and despair. At least when life was hard, you knew exactly where you stood and what needed to be done about it. Jake was calibrating the replacement navigation components when the earthquake hit. The ground shook so violently that he was thrown against the Lucky Strike's hull, and the crystal towers of the nearby city swayed like grass in a windstorm. Emergency alarms wailed across the spaceport as automated systems struggled to compensate for the seismic activity. It lasted only 30 seconds, but the damage was immediately apparent. Natural disaster, the Draconian Port Authority explained over the comm system, though their translation seemed uncertain. Emotional resonance cascade from the Ancient Mourner. All non-essential personnel should remain in secure locations until the effects subside. Jake stared at his translation device, wondering if it had malfunctioned. An emotional earthquake? That sounded like the kind of mystical nonsense that gave him a headache. But the evidence was hard to ignore. The planet's geological sensors were going crazy, and the local Draconians were all exhibiting signs of severe distress. Some were openly weeping, while others had simply curled up in corners and refused to move. The spaceport's chief engineer, an elderly Draconian named Velthera, approached Jake with obvious reluctance. Her normally iridescent scales had faded to a dull bronze, and her large eyes were filled with something that looked like desperate hope. She explained that the Ancient Mourner had been experiencing increasingly severe episodes of despair, and the resulting emotional shockwaves were beginning to threaten the planet's stability. "We need someone to attempt contact," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Someone whose mind cannot be overwhelmed by her sadness. Your species, humans, You are naturally resistant to empathic influence. You might be able to reach her when others cannot. Jake wanted to laugh. The idea that he, a down-on-his-luck cargo hauler, could succeed where an entire galactic civilization had failed was absurd. He told Velthera as much, pointing out that he had no training in psychology, no understanding of draconian culture, and no particular talent for helping anyone with anything more complex than a busted hyperdrive. But Velthara's desperation was genuine, and she explained that the situation was becoming critical. The ancient mourner's emotional states were tied to the planet's geological stability through mechanisms that even draconian scientists didn't fully understand. If her condition continued to deteriorate, the resulting seismic activity could destroy their civilization within a matter of weeks. They had nothing left to lose by trying something completely different. The journey to the ancient mourner's dwelling took Jake through landscapes that defied his understanding of physics. Crystalline formations reached toward the sky like frozen music, their surfaces reflecting light in patterns that seemed to respond to his emotions. The very air around him felt heavy with accumulated sadness, as if centuries of tears had been dissolved into the atmosphere itself. Zephyra was larger than anything Jake had imagined. Her serpentine form stretched for hundreds of meters, coiled around a crystal spire that jutted from the planet's surface like a massive antenna. Her scales, which should have been brilliant gold according to the descriptions he'd been given, were now a lifeless gray that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Even from a distance, the weight of her despair was almost physically crushing. Jake approached slowly, his boots crunching on crystallized tears that had fallen like snow around her resting place. The closer he got, the more difficult it became to maintain his usual pragmatic outlook. Memories of every loss and disappointment in his life came flooding back with renewed intensity. His failed marriage, his brother's death, the slow erosion of his dreams into mere survival. For a moment, he almost turned around and walked away. But something in his stubborn nature refused to surrender to despair. Jake had survived too much to be defeated by someone else's sadness, no matter how profound. He cleared his throat and called out a greeting in Standard Galactic, feeling foolish but determined to make some kind of contact. Zephyra's massive head turned toward him with glacial slowness. Her eyes were pools of ancient grief, filled with the weight of millennia spent in hopeless suffering. When she spoke, her voice was like distant thunder, barely above a whisper but somehow carrying immense power. She asked what he wanted, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer and found it tiresome. Jake found himself at a loss for words. What could he possibly say to someone whose sadness had become legendary across the galaxy? He wasn't a therapist or a spiritual guide or even particularly good with people under normal circumstances. He was just a mechanic who fixed broken things for a living. But maybe that was enough to start with. "I heard your engines were giving you trouble," he said, surprising himself with the casual tone. "Thought maybe I could take a look, see if there's anything I can do to help." Zephyra stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to process what she had heard. No one had ever compared her to a machine before, or suggested that her condition might be something that could be repaired rather than endured. The concept was so alien to her experience that she almost smiled, though the expression died before it could fully form. Jake explained his background, his years spent fixing everything from mining equipment to starship drives. He talked about the satisfaction of taking something broken and making it work again. The simple pleasure of solving practical problems with practical solutions. He admitted that he didn't understand much about emotions or philosophy, but he knew how to diagnose problems and find solutions. "Sometimes the issue isn't as complicated as people think," he said, settling down on a nearby crystal formation as if he had all the time in the world. "Sometimes you just need someone to look at the problem from a different angle, see what everyone else missed." For the first time in centuries, Zephyra found herself curious about something. This small, unremarkable human was treating her like a puzzle to be solved, rather than a tragedy to be mourned. It was such a novel approach that she almost forgot to be sad, though only for a moment. Jake spent the next several hours simply talking to Zephyra, treating her like any other client with a complicated problem. He asked about her symptoms when they had started, what made them better or worse. He listened to her history without judgment or offers of easy solutions, taking mental notes the way he would when diagnosing a failing ship system. What emerged from their conversation was a picture of someone who had been so thoroughly analyzed and theorized about that she had lost track of her own actual experience. Every emotion she felt had been categorized by experts, every thought dissected by philosophers. She had become a living case study rather than an individual being, defined entirely by her suffering rather than by anything else about herself. "When's the last time anyone asked you what you actually wanted?" Jake asked, leaning back against the crystal formation. "Not what would make you happy or cure your sadness, but just what you'd like to do with your time." Zephyra considered the question for longer than it should have taken. The answer was disturbing. She couldn't remember anyone asking her that in centuries. Every interaction had been focused on her condition, on finding ways to fix her or study her or learn from her. She had become so identified with her sadness that she had forgotten she might be anything else. Jake nodded as if this confirmed something he had suspected. "That's your first problem right there. You've been turned into a project instead of a person. Nobody can function properly when they're being treated like a broken machine that exists only to be repaired." He told her about his own experience after the mining accident, when everyone from doctors to insurance adjusters to well-meaning friends had treated him like a collection of symptoms rather than a human being. The constant focus on what was wrong with him had made it impossible to remember what was right with him, creating a feedback loop that made recovery much harder than it needed to be. "The thing about fixing machines," Jake explained, "is that you can't just focus on what's broken. You have to understand how the whole system is supposed to work, what it was designed to do. Otherwise, you might fix the immediate problem but create 3 new ones in the process." Zephyra found this perspective oddly comforting. She had been approached by healers and philosophers and scientists, but never by someone who saw her as a complex system that had somehow gotten out of calibration. The mechanical metaphor stripped away some of the mystical weight that had accumulated around her condition, making it seem less like a cosmic curse and more like a solvable engineering problem. Jake asked her to describe what happiness had felt like before her condition developed. The request seemed strange at first, but as Zephyra searched her ancient memories, she began to rediscover experiences that had been buried under millennia of analysis and attempted cures. She remembered the simple pleasure of flight, the satisfaction of helping younger draconians learn to manage their empathic abilities, the joy of creating beautiful crystal formations through careful application of her natural powers. "So you know what the target state looks like," Jake said, as if this was an important breakthrough. "That's good. Gives us something to aim for instead of just trying to eliminate problems." He suggested they start with something simple and immediate, rather than trying to solve her entire condition at once. Jake had noticed that the crystal spire she was wrapped around had some interesting harmonic properties, and he wondered if she had ever experimented with using it as a kind of musical instrument. Most draconians, he had learned, could manipulate crystal structures with their natural abilities, and Zephyra was apparently one of the most powerful of her species. The suggestion seemed almost trivial compared to the grand therapeutic approaches that had been tried before, but Zephyra found herself intrigued despite her skepticism. She hadn't used her crystal-shaping abilities in centuries, having lost interest in creation when everything else had lost its meaning. But Jake's purely practical interest in the physics involved made it seem less loaded with emotional significance. With careful concentration, Zephyra began to reshape small sections of the crystal spire, creating chambers and passages that would resonate at specific frequencies. Jake offered suggestions based on his understanding of acoustics and harmonic theory, treating the project like any other engineering challenge. They worked together for hours, with Zephyra providing the power and Jake contributing design insights. The first notes that emerged from their improvised instrument were hesitant and rough, but they were undeniably music. Zephyra felt a tiny flicker of something that wasn't sadness as she heard sounds that she had created, shaped by her own choices rather than by therapeutic intentions. It wasn't happiness exactly, but it was definitely different from the endless gray emptiness that had defined her existence. Jake grinned at the sound, genuinely pleased with their work. "Not bad for a first attempt. The resonance characteristics need some fine-tuning, but the basic structure is solid. We could probably optimize the chamber dimensions to improve the harmonic range." For Zephyra, being praised for something she had accomplished rather than pitied for something she suffered was a completely novel experience. Jake was treating their crystal instrument as a legitimate engineering project, worthy of his professional attention and expertise. The casual assumption that she was capable of learning and improving was something she had almost forgotten was possible. As the day wore on, other Draconians began to gather at a respectful distance, drawn by the unusual sounds coming from the ancient mourner's dwelling. They watched in amazement as their most tragic figure worked alongside the human mechanic, creating something new rather than simply enduring something old. The very air around the crystal spire seemed lighter, as if some of the accumulated sadness was finally beginning to dissipate. Jake didn't seem to notice the gathering crowd, focused entirely on the technical challenges of their project. He suggested modifications to improve the crystal structure's acoustic properties and praised Zephyra's ability to implement complex changes with precision. For the first time in centuries, she felt like she was being seen as competent rather than just pitiable. The breakthrough moment came when Jake asked her to play something she remembered from before her condition developed. Zephyra hesitated, then slowly began to coax a melody from the crystal that she had learned as a young dragon. The notes were simple and ancient, a lullaby that draconian mothers had sung to their children for thousands of years. As the familiar melody filled the air, Zephyra felt something crack inside her chest. It wasn't a return to joy exactly, but it was the first genuine emotion other than sadness that she had experienced in millennia. The realization that she could still create something beautiful, still contribute something meaningful to the world, sent ripples through her psyche that would take time to fully process. Word of the human mechanic's interaction with the ancient mourner spread across Draconia Prime like wildfire. Within hours, delegations of officials, healers, and curious citizens were making pilgrimages to witness this unprecedented development. For the first time in living memory, Zephyra had engaged in voluntary activity that wasn't directly related to managing her suffering. Jake found the attention uncomfortable and tried to deflect the growing crowd's interest. He insisted that what they were doing was nothing special, just basic troubleshooting applied to an unusual problem. But the Draconians saw something miraculous in the simple fact that their ancient mourner was creating music instead of emanating despair. The emotional dampening field around her dwelling had weakened noticeably, allowing other Draconians to approach closer than they had been able to in centuries. The planetary leadership requested a formal audience with Jake, hoping to understand his methodology so it could be documented and replicated. He tried to explain that there was no methodology, no grand strategy or revolutionary technique. He had simply treated Zephyra like a person with a problem, rather than a cosmic mystery to be solved. The Draconians found this explanation both frustrating and profound. "You must understand," Elder Kirthana said during the meeting, her scales shimmering with barely contained excitement. "We have consulted the greatest minds in the galaxy. Therapists, philosophers, quantum consciousness specialists, empathic healers whose abilities span multiple dimensions of reality. None of them achieved in decades what you accomplished in a single day." Jake shrugged uncomfortably. Maybe that was the problem. Too many experts, not enough common sense. Sometimes when you're trying too hard to be clever, you miss the obvious stuff. He explained his philosophy of mechanical repair. Start with the simplest possible explanation, test one variable at a time, and never assume that complex problems require complex solutions. Most of the worst breakdowns he had seen were caused by simple issues that had been overlooked because everyone was looking for sophisticated causes. The Draconians struggled to accept that their most profound spiritual crisis might have such a mundane solution. Their culture valued depth and complexity, seeing surface simplicity as a sign of shallow thinking. The idea that centuries of advanced therapeutic intervention had been less effective than basic human pragmatism challenged their fundamental assumptions. About wisdom and expertise, Jake returned to Zephyra's dwelling the next day to continue their work on the crystal instrument, ignoring the growing crowd of observers. He had brought some basic tools from his ship, including a sonic calibrator that could help them fine-tune the crystal chambers for optimal resonance. Zephyra was waiting for him, and for the first time in their brief acquaintance, she seemed genuinely pleased to see someone. Their conversation had evolved beyond purely technical matters. Jake told her about his travels across human space, describing worlds where people built communities in the most unlikely places and found ways to thrive despite overwhelming challenges. He talked about the mining colonies on airless moons, the agricultural settlements on desert planets, the research stations orbiting dangerous stars. In every case, the key to survival had been focusing on practical problems that could be solved, rather than dwelling on circumstances that couldn't be changed. Zephyra found these stories fascinating in a way that surprised her. The human approach to adversity was so different from draconian philosophy. Where her people sought to understand suffering and find meaning in it, humans seemed to simply accept that life was difficult and get on with the business of living anyway. There was something refreshing about Jake's assumption that problems existed to be solved, rather than contemplated. As they worked together over the following days, Zephyra began to rediscover aspects of herself that had nothing to do with her condition. She remembered her interest in mathematical harmonics, her talent for geological manipulation, her enjoyment of teaching younger draconians about the subtleties of empathic communication. Jake treated these recovered memories as valuable resources rather than painful reminders of what she had lost. "The way I see it," he said while adjusting the crystal resonance chambers, "you're like a ship that's been running on emergency power for so long that everyone forgot it had main engines. We're not trying to fix something that's broken. We're just bringing systems back online that got shut down somewhere along the way." This perspective was revolutionary for Zephyra. Every therapeutic approach she had experienced had focused on her sadness as the primary problem that needed to be eliminated. Jake was the first person to suggest that her sadness might be a secondary symptom of something else entirely. The systematic shutdown of everything that had once given her life meaning and purpose. The breakthrough came when Jake asked her to teach him something about draconian empathic abilities. He was curious about the technical aspects of how emotional fields worked and whether there were ways to modulate or control them. Zephyra was initially hesitant, pointing out that her empathic abilities had been compromised by her condition for millennia. "So what?" Jake said with characteristic bluntness. "Just because something's not working perfectly doesn't mean it can't work at all. Maybe your empathic field is stuck in one mode instead of being completely broken. Let's see what happens if we try to shift it deliberately." Under Jake's encouragement, Zephyra began to experiment with her empathic abilities for the first time in centuries. Instead of trying to eliminate her sadness, she attempted to modulate it, to find different emotional frequencies that she could broadcast. The results were inconsistent and often frustrating, but they represented genuine progress rather than resignation to permanent dysfunction. During one of these experimental sessions, something unexpected happened. As Zephyra focused on projecting a specific emotional frequency, she caught a glimpse of Jake's mental state. For just a moment, she sensed the depth of his own accumulated pain, the loneliness of years spent traveling between worlds with no real home, the lingering trauma from industrial accidents and corporate betrayals, the quiet desperation of a man who had learned to expect little from life. But underneath all that pain, she also sensed something else, a stubborn refusal to surrender. A practical determination to keep fixing things even when they seemed irreparable. A basic faith that problems existed to be solved. Jake's sadness was different from hers. Where her despair was absolute and overwhelming, his was simply another working condition to be managed while he got on with more important business. The realization was startling. Zephyra had assumed that her suffering was unique in its intensity and hopelessness. Discovering that Jake carried his own substantial burden of grief while still functioning effectively suggested that the problem wasn't the existence of sadness but her relationship to it. Perhaps she had been trying to eliminate something that was meant to be integrated instead. The moment of empathic connection with Jake fundamentally changed Zephyra's understanding of her own condition. She had spent millennia believing that her sadness was a unique curse that set her apart from all other beings in the galaxy. Discovering that someone could carry comparable pain while still functioning, still creating, still helping others, shattered her assumption that suffering and meaning were mutually exclusive. Jake noticed her startled expression and asked if something was wrong. When Zephyra explained what she had sensed, he seemed more embarrassed than surprised. He admitted that life had handed him plenty of reasons to be bitter and hopeless, but he had learned early that dwelling on problems never solved them. The key was to acknowledge pain without letting it become the center of everything else. "The way I figure it," he said, continuing to work on the crystal calibrations, "sadness is like any other tool. It tells you when something's wrong, same as how pain tells you when you're injured. But you don't stop using your hand just because it hurts sometimes. You fix whatever's causing the problem and get back to work. This casual acceptance of emotional pain as simply another aspect of existence was unlike anything Zephyra had encountered. In centuries of therapy and philosophical discussion, the Draconians and their galactic allies had treated her sadness as an aberration to be cured, a deviation from the natural order that needed correction. Jake treated it as an unfortunate but manageable reality, no different from a chronic mechanical problem that required ongoing maintenance. Over the next few days, their conversations expanded beyond technical matters to include Jake's personal philosophy of resilience. He told her about the mining accident that had nearly killed him, the corporate negligence that had caused it, and the long recovery process that had taught him to separate what could be changed from what simply had to be endured. His approach was pragmatic rather than inspirational. Accept reality as it is, identify what can be improved, and focus your energy on actionable solutions. Zephyra began applying these principles to her own situation. Instead of trying to eliminate her capacity for sadness, she started experimenting with different ways of experiencing and expressing it. She discovered that her emotional field could be modulated like a musical instrument, creating different qualities of melancholy that weren't necessarily unpleasant. Some forms of sadness were heavy and oppressive, while others were lighter and almost nostalgic. The breakthrough came when Jake suggested they collaborate on a larger musical project. The crystal spire they had been working with was part of a network of similar formations across the planet's surface. If they could create harmonic resonances between multiple sites, they might be able to compose music on a planetary scale. The technical challenges involved would require both Jake's engineering knowledge and Zephyra's ability to manipulate crystal structures across vast distances. For Zephyra, the project represented something she had never experienced during her millennia of suffering, a goal that had nothing to do with curing her condition. They weren't trying to make her happy or eliminate her sadness. They were simply working together to create something beautiful and complex that would stand as an achievement independent of her emotional state. The work required Zephyra to use abilities she hadn't exercised in centuries. She had to project her consciousness across the planet's surface, sensing the resonant frequencies of crystal formations thousands of kilometers away. Jake provided technical guidance through their communication link, helping her calculate the precise modifications needed to achieve specific harmonic relationships between distant sites. As they worked, Zephyra's empathic field began to change in ways that surprised everyone, including herself. Instead of the uniform gray despair that had characterized her emotional emanations for so long, complex patterns began to emerge. There were still elements of sadness, but they were woven together with determination, curiosity, and something that might eventually become satisfaction. The planetary monitoring systems registered the changes immediately. The seismic instability that had plagued Draconia Prime for centuries began to stabilize as Zephyra's emotional field shifted from chaotic despair to structured melancholy. Weather patterns that had been disrupted by her psychic emanations started to normalize. The dampening effect on other Draconians' emotional abilities diminished significantly. Jake seemed oblivious to the cosmic significance of what they were accomplishing, remaining focused on the technical aspects of their project. He complained about harmonic interference from atmospheric conditions and suggested improvements to the crystal resonance algorithms with the same casual professionalism he would apply to any engineering challenge. His matter-of-fact attitude helped Zephyra maintain perspective on their work as simply an interesting problem to be solved. The first successful planetary scale musical composition was a simple piece based on mathematical progressions that Jake had learned during his technical training. The melody wasn't particularly complex, but hearing it resonate across an entire world through crystal formations that she had personally shaped gave Zephyra a sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with healing or therapy or finding happiness. As word of their success spread, Zephyra found herself facing a new kind of attention from the galactic community. Instead of being seen as a tragic figure who needed to be cured, she was now recognized as someone who had overcome enormous challenges to achieve something unprecedented. The shift in perception was subtle but profound. She was being valued for what she could do rather than pitied for what she couldn't feel. Jake's repair work on the Lucky Strike was completed during this period, but he found himself reluctant to leave. The shipping company had already written off his cargo delivery as a loss, and his reputation for reliability was probably beyond salvage. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was doing work that actually mattered. The collaboration with Zephyra had taught him that his mechanical skills could be applied to problems far more complex and meaningful than keeping aging cargo haulers functional. When Zephyra asked if he would be willing to extend his stay to work on more ambitious musical projects, Jake surprised himself by agreeing. The logical part of his mind pointed out that he couldn't afford to take time off from freight hauling, and that getting involved in alien spiritual matters was probably a mistake. But the engineer in him was fascinated by the technical possibilities, and the human in him was reluctant to abandon someone who had become something like a friend. Their partnership had evolved into something neither of them had expected. Zephyra was rediscovering abilities and interests that had been buried under millennia of therapeutic focus on her condition. Jake was finding applications for his practical skills that went far beyond simple mechanical repair. Together, they were creating something entirely new that belonged to neither of their individual traditions. 6 months after Jake's unexpected arrival on Draconia Prime, the galaxy's most renowned experts in consciousness and emotion gathered to witness something unprecedented: the ancient mourner performing her first public concert in over 3 millennia. The auditorium was a natural amphitheater carved from living crystal, its acoustics enhanced by the same harmonic principles that Jake and Zephyra had discovered during their collaboration. Zephyra's appearance had transformed dramatically over the months of their partnership. Her scales had regained much of their original golden luster, though they now displayed subtle patterns that shifted between light and shadow in ways that reflected her complex emotional state. She was no longer the uniform gray creature of absolute despair, but neither was she the purely joyful being that her people remembered from ancient times. She had become something new, a dragon who had learned to create beauty from sorrow. The composition they performed together was unlike anything the galaxy had ever heard. Jake operated a control system of his own design that allowed him to modulate the planetary crystal network in real time, while Zephyra shaped the resonances through her psychic abilities and provided the emotional framework that gave the music its haunting power. The piece they had created acknowledged sadness without surrendering to it, weaving melancholy themes together with expressions of determination, curiosity, and hard-won wisdom. Representatives from thousands of worlds listened in amazement as the music resonated, not just through the auditorium, but across the entire planet, turning Draconia Prime itself into a massive musical instrument. The emotional complexity of the composition challenged every listener's assumptions about the relationship between suffering and creativity. Here was proof that joy and sadness need not be enemies, that profound beauty could emerge from the integration of all emotional experiences, rather than the elimination of unpleasant ones. Jake watched the audience's reaction with amused satisfaction. The same beings who had spent centuries trying to cure Zephyra's sadness were now celebrating her ability to transform it into art. He couldn't help but see the irony in their enthusiasm for what was essentially a very complex engineering project, but he had learned to appreciate the Draconian's tendency to find cosmic significance in practical achievements. The success of their collaboration had implications that extended far beyond Draconia Prime. Word of the human mechanic's unconventional approach to psychological healing spread throughout the galaxy, inspiring new research into the relationship between emotional acceptance and mental health. Universities established exchange programs between human technical schools and alien therapy centers, exploring how practical problem-solving methods might complement traditional healing approaches. For Zephyra, the most important change was the simplest one. She had remembered what it felt like to be needed for her abilities, rather than pitied for her limitations. The planetary crystal network they had developed required ongoing maintenance and expansion, giving her purposeful work that utilized her unique talents. She was no longer the galaxy's saddest dragon, but rather its most accomplished harmonic engineer, someone who happened to carry a profound sadness that enriched rather than destroyed her contributions to the world. Jake found himself offered positions with research institutions and therapy centers across known space, all eager to study his methods and apply them to their own challenging cases. He turned down most of these offers, preferring to continue his collaboration with Zephyra while maintaining the independence that came with his freight-hauling business. However, he did accept a contract to design similar harmonic systems for other worlds struggling with psychically sensitive inhabitants. The relationship between human pragmatism and galactic sophistication had been permanently altered by their partnership, where advanced civilizations had approached consciousness as a mystical phenomenon requiring transcendent solutions. Jake had demonstrated the power of treating it as simply another complex system that could be understood, modified, and optimized through careful analysis and practical intervention. Zephyra's condition never completely resolved in the way that traditional therapy had envisioned. She remained capable of profound sadness and continued to experience periods of melancholy that affected the planetary crystal network. But these emotional states were no longer pathological obstacles to be overcome. Instead, they had become integral elements of a larger system that created beauty, meaning, and connection on a scale that purely happy beings could never achieve. The ancient mourner became the ancient composer, and her dwelling place transformed from a site of pilgrimage for the desperate into a center of learning for artists, engineers, and healers from across the galaxy. Students came to study not just her musical innovations but the philosophy behind them. The radical idea that problems existed to be worked with rather than eliminated, that healing meant integration rather than cure, and that the most profound solutions often emerged from the simplest approaches. Jake eventually decided to make Draconia Prime his permanent base of operations, converting the Lucky Strike into a mobile workshop that could support their expanding projects. He never completely understood why the galaxy had made such a big deal out of what seemed to him like basic troubleshooting, but he appreciated the steady work and the opportunity to tackle engineering challenges unlike anything in human space. Years later, when reporters asked him to explain his revolutionary approach to healing, Jake would shrug and repeat the same simple philosophy that had guided his work from the beginning. Most problems aren't as complicated as people think. You just need to figure out what's actually broken instead of what people assume is broken, then fix that instead of everything else. Zephyra's transformation became a legend that spread throughout the galaxy, inspiring new approaches to consciousness, creativity, and the relationship between suffering and meaning. But at its heart, the story remained beautifully simple. Sometimes the most profound healing comes not from eliminating pain, but from teaching it to sing in harmony with everything else that makes life worth living. And sometimes the most unlikely partnerships between the most different beings can create something more beautiful than either could achieve alone. The sad dragon had learned to make music from her sorrow, and the pragmatic human had discovered that fixing broken things could include fixing broken hearts. Together, they had proven that no problem was too cosmic to yield to patience, practical thinking, and the simple human conviction that everything broken could be repaired by someone willing to understand how it was supposed to work.